Welcome everybody to our last week of a joint course. So today you will have a lecture of Professor Sara Garces from the Istituto Politecnico de Tomar, but it's a specialist in rock art, and she will talk about the methodological approach to understand the prehistoric art. Thank you, Sara. The floor
Thank you,
is
Marta.
yours.
Okay, thank you, Marta. Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to speak a little bit about the methodological approaches that we are using in rock art studies in general. Obviously, it's impossible in 1 hour to speak about everything in detail, but I want you to have a general idea of some approaches that we are using in different types of sites, rock art sites and rock art contexts. And I hope that you will have a general idea of what to do in a rock art site after this lecture, okay? I'm going to start by giving a general idea of what type of rock art sites we normally can have and work on. Obviously, there are many different contexts that can present rock art, a rock art site. Generally speaking, we can find rock art in caves, and it can be in a cave that is more or less controlled from the conservation point of view and touristic point of view, like this one in Montevieso in Spain, or can be in caves that have no management approach so far. And we can, inside caves, this is the typical type of rock art that we can have, like paintings or engravings. Both techniques can be found in caves or in open air sites. In caves, this is a typical type of rock art that we can be found in hand stencils or animals, human figures, geometric figures, or even in different techniques like engravings. Anything that you will see today in this presentation, we can find in both types of rock art sites or in open air sites like these ones. Open air sites can be very different. I'm not going to show every type of open air rock art sites that we can have found. This is a typical painted schematic art site from Iberian Peninsula, for example. But we can have also engraved sites near the rivers. We can have, it's more not that common, engravings also in open air sites like these ones, and both paintings and engravings inside caves. A typical open air rock art site in Iberian Peninsula, for example, is something like this. It can be a shelter, it can be just a rock support or a wall, or a group of stones that can have some paintings or engravings. This is a typical schematic art site that in at least all Iberian Peninsula, it's quite typical to find. Schematic art, we are talking about Neolithic, Chalcolithic and Bronze Age period. And it can be found a little bit more or less all over around the Mediterranean. But we know that there is a big concentration of these kind of sites in Iberian Peninsula, for example, in the quartzite crusts in highlands. So this would be a typical site, or in caves, as you already saw. This is also a very typical landscape that surrounds these type of sites. And one thing that we can already see that it's obvious, it's the difficulty to get to this type of sites. Normally, rock art sites are not easy to get. Either we have to climb, or we have to crawl, or we have to go inside very narrow holes. Normally, it's a type of research that can be a little difficult to do, mainly to access the sites. Regarding techniques, what can we find, both open air or inside caves? We found paintings, and inside paintings we can have this kind of paintings, normally in different colors. Red, yellow, white, black are the main 4 colors that are typical to find anywhere in the world. We can also have different colors like purple, sometimes, and a lot of variations from the red, for example, orange, browns, but purple is quite rare, generally speaking. But paintings also can be made directly on the wall or with negative techniques like blowing around the hands, that becomes a hand stencil. There are many different types of rock art ways of doing a figure. Very typical also from schematic rock art in Iberian Peninsula, we have this type of very simplified type of rock art. We can find human figures, we can find animal figures, or a very big quantity of different types of geometric figures all over the territories. When we think about what to do in a rock art site, I'm going to give a general idea of more or less what to do just for us to follow a procedure, okay? Getting to a rock art site, taking one picture and thinking, okay, that's it. I took some pictures, it's done. We can leave. It's not as simple as it looks. Not only the logistics to get to a rock art site, but it depends on the type of rock art site that we have. What should we do? Obviously, there are different and general guidelines to work in a place like this. But then, obviously, we also know that each site is very unique. And sometimes we really have to think and consider and prepare very well our approach, taking into consideration the conservation of the site, the conservation status of the site, if it's good or bad, if we can touch walls or not, and even the approach that we're going to have depending if are engravings or paintings. Okay, so first step, arriving to any rock art site, it doesn't matter if it's a cave or open air, we should first check all the panels and number all the panels and make a very good description and like a spreadsheet or a form filled from each one of the panels. Make sure that we know exactly what is there, only paintings or engravings or both. It's not that rare that we can find both paintings and engravings in the same panel, for example, in caves. Make a very good idea of our space, how many panels we have and what do we have. Then we have different type of approaches. We can make a photographic record of each panel. We can make a photogrammetry or use a scanner to make a 3D of the site or of each panel. That's also a possibility. In this case, for example, this is a good idea of what a scanner of an entire cave that was done in Escorial Cave in Portugal looks like. Obviously, this was a very specific product of a project to do the entire 3D of a cave. Why is it important, for example, to use 3D technology in rock art? First, because it gives us a more accurate shape of the panel or the site. And we know that many times rock art sites where the rock artist took advantage of very naturalistic features of the rock support itself. So to have a 3D of exactly shape of the panel and how rock art interacts with that panel give us a very good idea of this place. Not only that, we can have access many times to this site, to this panel, to make a very good description. We can even make then a digital tracing through the 3D. There are many advantages that we also that we can use with the 3D. But the main important is there is one very specific rule, especially when we are talking about paintings. We should never, never, ever touch a panel with rock art paintings. So it's very important that we know exactly the position of each one of the panels. And the 3D is going to help us to check again and again the position of the rock art in a panel without touching it, okay? And if we cannot touch a rock art panel, how can we do a tracing or a drawing without using plastic or paper on the top of this panel. Using plastics or papers are considered very old methodology. It was okay until more or less 20 years ago, when obviously rock art researchers started to realize that putting a plastic or a paper on the top of a painting, it didn't matter if it was open air site or a cave site, it's not good for the conservation of the paintings. So only through photography, and nowadays through photogrammetry or a 3D scanner, we can actually have a copy of this panel in a very accurate way without touching or damaging the panel. Having a 3D of entire site is also very useful, because then we can actually understand and study better the different location of different types of panels. I give you an example. This is the plan that was made through the 3D of entire cave of Squirrel Cave. And the numbers regard the new counting of panels that we found inside the cave. Then we can make different coloration for what's a painting or an engraving. We can study the different location of the panels. And it's a very useful source to study where the rock art panels were put inside a cave. This also goes for an open air site, okay? Making a 3D, this is a 3D of an engraved panel from Squirrel Cave. It's actually quite useful because there are some techniques these days that only through photogrammetry we can actually have a very good visualization of engravings in panels. Doing a tracing of engravings just with photography can be quite tricky, quite difficult, because it depends on the technique of the engraving. For example, in this case, it's a scratched animal. It can be very difficult to see when we have the texture of the rock itself. But today we have some technology that we take out the texture of the 3D, and we can actually help us very much to better see the engravings and to make a digital tracing after this step in a very easy way. And we didn't touch the panel. An example of a 3D also from a painted panel. The process to work with the paintings in the computer using software, well, to manipulate images using certain softwares, it's a little different from the engravings, okay? There are different protocols of tracing for different types of rock art, but it's also very useful. And the main part is that we didn't have to use any extra material like plastics or papers, and we didn't damage absolutely no part of the site. One very important tool and powerful tool for any rock art research or anybody that is minimal that wants to work with any rock art site these days, it's a tool called dstretch. Dstretch, it's a plugin from a very small and light software called IMQP. That what makes it to enhance all the colors from a panel. This only works for paintings. And it's going to help us to better see or to see whatever painting that it doesn't matter the color that it was made from a panel that normally we cannot see with our naked eye. This is an extreme important tool that any rock art researcher these days works with. And it's actually very powerful because this is the only way many times that we know that there is rock art in a certain panel, because many times it shows rock art in panels that we absolutely cannot see anything there, only with our eyes, okay? A few years ago, we would take pictures, go to Photoshop and do some work of brightness and light and contrast to see if we could find anything else. But these days with dstretch in our phones, because it's an app today, or with in a photographic camera that is also possible to have, or just in our computers using a normal photograph from a normal camera or even a phone, we can actually see much faster and much more accurate, with much more accuracy, if there is paintings in a certain place or not. I really invite you to go to this website, tstretch.com, to read a little bit about this powerful tool and to learn how it works. Because if any of you is interested to work with rock art, I'll guarantee you that you will have to work with this one day. Very important aspect. This stretch was it was made to be used in paintings. Okay, we don't need much equipment or material to do a good picture. There are certain rules regarding lighting and shade in a panel, but we don't need a very fancy camera to do a nice picture. We don't need filters, lighting, or special type of camera to do to work with this stretch. It was made to be used in paintings, and we don't have to do or manipulate any of the panel before we take a picture for this stretch. Okay, we don't have to use paper, we don't have to use plastic, we don't have to put water to enhance the paintings. Absolutely nothing. This stretch will do this work for us, and this stretch doesn't have any impact on the conservation of the panel. This is some of the results from a normal picture of a panel and a D-stretch filter on it. You can see how powerful it is, because it shows us things that with a lot of difficulty we can see in our left image. And this is another example of how, after a digital tracing from original picture, using this stretch on it, and then working a little bit in Photoshop just to keep the original image. This is some of the work that we can do regarding paintings. A little more example in open air site. So these examples that I gave you, this is in a cave, okay? Here we have an open air panel that is in a very bad conservation state. This is the powerful of this stretch, what it can make to help us to enhance the paintings. This is another one. As you can see, we barely can see some red pigments on it, and this stretch can actually show us much more that exists there. And something that is very important that I put in all of these pictures to show you is this sticker. It's a small sticker that actually what's important here, it's the reference of a scale, okay? We can use a normal scale with a picture. We can use a small sticker that already has a scale. The important thing is that we have always in any of these pictures a reference of the scale, okay? As in any archaeological work or drawing representation. The next step would be obviously using our photos and using our filters from this stretch. We make a process of trying to enhance and show in a drawing our painting or our engraving, it depends, some of the features of the panel, like the fractures, for example, and do some work with digital tracing to try to show exactly what is in a panel. This is another example of a very hard panel. Here, maybe some of you that can have more trained eyes maybe can see some scratches, some lines. It's very hard to understand if there is a figure here. It's not a painting, it's an engraving. The fact that it's inside the cave makes it extremely hard to see, because normally engravings inside caves are scratched, are not packed. So they are a little bit more difficult to see. But our work with the photographic procedure inside the cave is doing a lot of photographs using different light sources and light directions, so we can better see what's in a panel after using only digital tracing. This is an example that there is an animal here represented, even if it's very hard to see. Another good example, what would be the procedure then of doing digital tracing? Obviously, this is a part that would take some hours in the computer, but we can see a cabin shape figure here in this panel. Doing the work in, for example, in Photoshop, that is the software that we normally use, it gives a little work, but then the possibilities are quite big because it's very easy for us to transform an image to whatever final product that you need. You need an image for an article, a book, your thesis, or just a catalog of a work or a report, it doesn't matter. After the work is done, it's very easy for you to transform your work in whatever you need to be done to present anywhere. Another way of doing digital tracing, it's not only through photography inside a cave or through a photography of a panel in open-air sites. This is an example of engravings that are in a rock, but in open air. And in this case, it's a little tricky because when we are in an open-air site and we have engravings, maybe we can see them better because they are packed inside instead of scratched. But we also have different problems. For example, either we really take advantage of a very specific day or a very specific time of the day to make a photograph, or we have a lot of problems with shade, with the sunlight that it's not perfect, it's not it's not in the perfect time. We actually cannot spend an entire day waiting for the perfect light. Even because the perfect light's going to be there just for a couple of minutes and we would need more time. So what we are using today is we still use a photogrammetry or a 3D of a rock, but then there are different types of softwares that we can manipulate this 3D in order to enhance the engravings, enhance the features of the rock support, for example, and that will allow us to make a digital tracing on our Photoshop, for example, after seeing much more details than the ones that we see with our naked eye. For example, in this case, this is the Cobregança rock art site in Portugal, in Mação. And if you notice that the central picture is the original image of the 3D, but if you can see some of the details of the other models, we can actually see a lot of small details in the 3D model that were manipulated using software after, that we see more engravings than we see in the original rock. Okay, this is very important, and these are also very powerful techniques that we can use today. And then from using all these models in the Photoshop, we can make a tracing of this rock, and we can actually have a very good result because we see much more engravings in the final tracing than we can actually see in the rock itself. This is another rock nearby, also the same example. This rock is not in a very good conservation state, as you can see, but it's still possible to see some of the engravings, and giving a good record, not only of the engravings, but the shape of the rock actually give us a very nice two-dimension drawings. Okay, so we go from a 3D to a 2D representation of the rock. Sorry. So this was an example for engravings. For paintings, it's a little bit more or less the same procedure, but we have to take into consideration that for paintings, we have to use this stretch to better see what's in a panel. In this case, it's a very nice panel. This is from Cueva Barcelejo in Spain. We can see a lot of human figures in red in both left and right side of this water mark here in the middle. But we also can see with the discharge that we have some figures under this white stain of water in the panel. So what is the main process here? It's a little time consuming, mainly, not much when you start having some experience, but the idea is that we can show in the final representation of the panel, our representation, exactly the state of conservation of all the paintings, giving it a very accurate idea of how the panel is and how many figures there is, and counting the figures. And this is the ultimate goal for representation of these kind of panels. Another example from the book of Hipólito Collado about La Calderita site in Spain. This kind of presentation you can find in Hipólito Collado's red books in ResearchGate or Academia. It's very easy. This is regarding schematic rock art painted open-air site in Spain. And a very important aspect in this case is that the color of all these figures is not the same. The colors have different conservation states, or they were painted using different types of pigments. So it's very easy to understand that here in the photo we can see different types of figures. Some are darker than others, some are in red, we have figures in orange or very light orange, some of them. A very important aspect when we get some experience in doing some tracings, it's actually to try to give an accurate idea of these different types of colorations that we have in the pigments. This is a case that it's a very nice drawing because it gives us not only the different coloration of figures, but also the different conservation state of the figures, okay? We can see very well that some of the figures are much more visible than others. And this is very, very important for the interpretation of the site and the description of the site later. Some more examples of tracings of paintings, okay? I really suggest you to go check these publications. Everything is online. And it's also very nice if we can actually mix the 3D of the site, giving an idea of the distribution of the panels. This is another feature that we can use, how to understand the distribution of pigments or of the panels in a site if the site is very big. This is an example. Obrigado. This is an example. We have a very big site. We make a photogrammetry or the scanner of the entire site. We make a very good tracing of the panels. And this is a great way to show the distribution of the panels in a specific site. Another example of tracing that it's made directly on a rock that has an impact engraving, okay? All these examples, I'm showing you ways of not touching the rocks, not using plastic, not using papers, don't put anything on the top of the rocks, but through photogrammetry or photography, we can make, and we should make, only digital tracings in our rock art pieces. Okay, what else? Next procedure, obviously, counting the sites, the panels, making some work of statistics, what type of images you have, what type of pigments you have, basically a lot of work that's going to be good, not only for the interpretation, but for the counting and description of the sites, which is also very important. And a second step that we are working a lot, besides documentation of a rock art site, is applying archaeometry research in a rock art site. Going on. So, a next step, so far, it was a lot of information just for one methodological approach, okay? There's still a lot of work that we can do only for documenting a rock art properly. But there is another part of the work that it's very, very useful, And it's going to give us a lot of different information for us to make interpretation of a site. When we do archaeometry research in rock art, and probably some of you also will have opportunity for the next 2 years to see more presentations from my colleagues Hugo Gomes or Pierluigi Rossini or Virginia Latau, because they work in this area in the team much more. And it's a part of the research that it's also a lot of information to hold on, but it's a very unique way of us applying a multi-proxy approach to a rock art site. Using archaeometry research in a rock art site means that we have to deal with archaeology, with the prehistoric art, with photography, with geology, with geography, with topography, biology, chemistry, and physics. And this is not invented. This is literally a protocol that has been developed in the last few years, both for open air sites or cave sites. Obviously, that the protocol has to be adapted to the site itself. But what this means? It means that we take samples, or we can take samples from pigments or calcite or other type of things that can be used for a pigment characterization of the paintings, or for making datation of both pigments, both paintings and engravings. Okay, I'm going to try to explain generally, in general terms, what are more or less the work that we are developing in the last few years. But obviously this, in the end, is going to be a very big protocol of approach. But right now, this is the more accurate and more updated protocol that I can show you how to do and how to work in rock art. Another important aspect is that it's not compulsory to do archaeometry in every rock art site, okay? You need authorization to work in any rock art site as any other archaeological site. And for archaeometry analysis, you need specific authorizations that allow you to take samples of pigments or other things from the panel, okay? This is obviously a technique that is an evasive technique, so we need to take a small piece of the panel. Even we can do it in very tiny sizes. It's still an evasive technique. So don't forget that for any type of work or research in rock art sites, you must have proper authorizations from authorities to do anything, even for just documenting the site, okay? This protocol is not closed in the sense that everything has to be done in a rock art site. You can only do documentation, or you can go and do only archaeometry, or you can do the entire protocol that I'm showing you, but it's not closed. Yeah, it depends on your goals, what you want to know from the rock art site, what is the purpose of your sampling or analysis. This is very important for you to know too. Okay, sampling methodology. What should we do? First, we should take into consideration the stratigraphy of the figures. Okay. So when we get to a rock art site, what is the purpose? Do we want to know if there is different type of pigments in different types of figures? If there is a variation of pigments, for example, different shades of red or other type of colors? Is it important to know if the white figures have organics, for examples, or binders? Is it important to know if the blacks are charcoal or not, because charcoal can be dated, for example? So there's a lot of questions that we can make, or we should make, before we go and make an approach to a rock art site through archaeometry. Okay, this is very important. It's not useful to get to a site and just take samples just because. Okay, we should make the questions before. We should know exactly what we want to know before we do any of this strategy, and we always have to follow the conservation techniques, extraction techniques that are published in a lot of the articles that we see these days about archaeometry in rock art. Each sample should be extracted in areas where the pigment is observed or in areas where there are already fractures, okay? We should never sample a painting in the middle of the painting because it's going to damage the painting, it's going to show up. So there are some rules for pigment extraction that should be followed. And also there are specific equipment and material that we should use to make a sampling of pigments. For example, always use sterile scalps, always use sterile gloves. There's a lot of equipment that can be used and should be used only for each sample, okay? Never use the same blade for different types of samples. And the choice of where we should take the sample is very important, okay? The ultimate goal is not to damage, obviously, the figure or the panel. Sometimes, even if we really want to take a sample from somewhere, but we know it's going to damage a lot the panel, we should not take the sample, okay? The conservation of the site is always the first concern. Okay, what kind of scientific issues we can have related to pigment sampling? What is the archaeological context that is associated with the image? Okay, for example, we're making a small archaeological excavation in a rock art site that can help us to see what is the context, if there are tools or artifacts that can be correlated with the rock art panels. It's very useful. Checking the geographical area. Is there more rock art sites in the area? What is the chronology of these rock art sites? Is there anything very specific or different that is painted or engraved in this specific rock art site? We should look for the different types of coloration. We should look of the overlapping of images. So if there is one image in the top of the other, is this from the same chronology or not? Is this important to be take in consideration or not? The techniques, is it painted or engraving? And inside each one of these techniques, there are a very big wide range of different types of paintings or engravings, and to make these paintings or engravings. Typology of figures is also very important, because normally, not much in Paleolithic rock art, but schematic rock art can really give us a very big list of different types of figures. And and the consideration of the chronology of figures, okay? This is also very important. And for example, specifically for schematic rock art, this is an example. We still don't have a very good idea what are the oldest paintings and what are the most recent paintings. And we are talking about a span of 3,000-4,000 years. So sometimes this is the questions that we should make to try to actually evaluate the site much better. Taking all this in consideration, the methodologies that we can use. So we take the samples, what for? What are the methods that we can actually use to try to answer some of our questions? There are a big range of analysis that we can make, but I must tell you that it depends, okay? Taking one sample, we should know first that how big is that sample, because we cannot take big samples, as you know, and what methods are destructive. So I'm going to lose my sample if I use it there or not. There are methods that they don't destroy the sample, so I can reuse it in a different type of methodology. And another thing that it's also important is, why should I use a certain method and not another one? So what do I want the answers to be? What do I want to know? Do I want to know the inorganic materials of paintings, or should I know also the organics? Is it important to make a microstratigraphic analysis or not? We should know this in advance. We should know the methods quite well and know exactly what to expect from the methods, and then obviously to use according to the size and the amount of samples that we have, okay? These are some of the methodologies that we can actually use in rock art sampling. And for example, this is an example of a microstratigraphy that shows us the substrate, some concretions, where the pigment is, what things happen after the pigment was put in this panel, different type of things that happen. For example, these small black spots, we know that are charcoal, but are they part of the pigment or not? In this case, we were able to understand that these small pieces of charcoal are not part of the pigment, but are part of natural fires that happen in the area and attached this charcoal to the paint. This is very important because if it's not an accurate analysis, we could say, oh, they are mixing red pigment with charcoal for some reason, and we can make a datation of the charcoal and we have the chronology. But in this case, if you make a very accurate analysis, and especially using different colleagues from different expertise and different types of methodologies, this is how you understand and interpret better a rock art site. We knew that there are fires in the area and that actually it's not part of the pigments. So what type of methodologies do we use these days? Raman spectroscopy, it's very good for us to understand the chemical mineralogical composition, the production processes, so how the pigment is made, what happens to these pigments after the chemical reactions, and if there are degradation processes, okay? X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, it's a non-destructive multi-elemental analysis. It actually gives us a list of all the elements, mineral elements of a sample of a painting. It does not identify organic materials. So if we want to know if there are organic materials, we should use other types of methods. Then we can use scanning electron microscopy. It gives us a very good idea of the shape. So it's good for morphological observation of both organic or inorganic materials. Okay, we can actually from here, we can say that if the pigment was grounded or cutted or mixed, this type of shapes that's going to happen to the sample or the pigment itself. This is a good way or a method for us to show. Gas chromatography, we don't use it that much. Actually, we use it, I think, in one sample some years ago. It takes too long to have the results, if I remember, but it's a very nice method to identify organic compounds, so binders. If the pigment was mixed with something organic, plant-based or animal-based, this is a very nice method for us to understand the binders conditions of rock arts. And actually, there are not many methods that can show us if there are organic compounds in the samples. So it's a research area that is still going on, and there's still much to do because it's quite rare to find organic compounds in rock art paintings. And then we have Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. This is a very nice equipment that gives us elemental composition, increases the sensitivity of the analysis, give us also the organic substances if there are, okay? So it's not a very big equipment. Here we use it in IPT, for example, and it's a very nice equipment to show us if there are organic material in our painted analysis. What happens to all these type of methods? Obviously, they give us different types of spectra, which means they have to be interpreted by experts, okay? So we are working with chemicals, we are working with lab technicians, we are working with expertise in all of these types of methods and equipments, and these people have to work with us a lot to help us to make the interpretation of the spectra and understand the paintings through these results, okay? Obviously, that there are some things that are quite different, quite difficult to understand. For example, organic binders. It's still very difficult to find them, because of the age of the panel, the quality of the samples, the size of the samples, the place where the samples are coming from, not only the geographic place, the place of the rocket, the rock art itself. So it's going to depend on a lot of different uncontrolled situations that we will have, okay? I'm going to give you some examples of material that is already published. You can find it very easily online, of places that we have used a lot of these type of methodologies, so you can check a little bit with the details. This is a site in Spain, Bencarensa, 3 shelters quite near from each other, different colorations, different types of typology of rock art. We applied both Micro Haman and Fatir, and it was very interesting to find in a couple of 2 or 3 samples from 2 of these shelters that we actually found organics. One of them, the paintings were made of charcoal. We tried to make a datation, but we actually cannot extract enough charcoal from a sample to make a datation. So sometimes the theory works very well. It's charcoal, let's make a datation. But then the practice, when we actually take a sample, it's not that easy to take enough sample for making a proper datation. Okay, this is the paper that you can find very easily online. It gives you all the details. Another example where we found organic compounds derived from plants, or it seems so. It was in Brazil, open-air shelters. These binders were quite difficult to characterize because of how they make the pigment process, the operating chain of making the pigment process. It was quite difficult to understand the organics, but at least we could point out that they were probably mixed with some plant binders. These are open air sites examples, cave examples. We are working a lot lately in the First Art project, and not only with pigment characterization, but also with uranothorium datation of rock art. What is this uranothorium? You also can find online a lot of debate, a lot of papers debating this process. This is basically a procedure that makes the datation of calcite that covers a painting. So not the painting itself, as you saw, pigments are mineral, which means that they are not suitable for direct datation. But in this case, we can actually make a datation of the calcite on the top of the pigment and give it a minimum age or a maximum age, depending on the type of sample that we have. In the First Art project, we have been applying a little bit of everything that I exposed here, 2D and 3D digital documentation of cave presentations. In this case, First Art is very directed, not only, but there are a lot of caves involved in this procedure. We work a lot with photogrammetry, digital tracings of the panels. We even use 3D scanner in a couple of these caves. And then we apply a very rigorous and a very developed method of archaeometric analysis. We use optical microscopy, we use Raman spectroscopy, we use X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, we use the SEM, scanning electron microscopy. I already explained all these methods. And we also are using Fatir to try to find organics in our samples. In cave sites, it's quite difficult that we have enough samples to use all of these methods at the same time. Okay, sometimes one of the big difficulties of this project is that samples are really, really small, not only because of conservation issues of the sites. They are caves. Caves are much more protected than open air sites of rock art. In any case, there are rules for both type of sites how much of a sample we can take. But in certain caves, obviously, everything is very controlled. So samples have to be very, very small, minimum size. And sometimes we really have to choose a specific method because we won't have enough sample for everything. We are using a lot absolute dating by uranothorium of the calcite on the top of paintings or engravings. And we are also trying to find the presence of human DNA, human ancient DNA in pigments. This was a novelty from this project that took into consideration the way that many of cave paintings were done. Obviously, there are the manipulation of the pigments with our hands and saliva, for example, and maybe this is an hypothesis, we can find human ancient DNA in pigments in caves. This is a work that is being developed right now. We still have this project. We have a lot of sites that are being approached as we speak. And all this is part of what we call a multi-proxies analysis, okay, of many different types of sites. Don't forget that all these procedures have to be adapted to the site, have to be thought before we go to the site, because sometimes open air sites and cave sites present us different challenges and different ways of approaching the site. Why is it important to use a multi-proxy strategy? We can characterize pigment components, we can identify raw materials, we can identify possible production processes, application techniques, sometimes, and depending on what you're using to make a chronology assessment, it's also very important, not always possible as we think, okay? And why do we do all this? What is the ultimate goal? All these studies is not just for us to understand the rock art sites better or the rock art panels or make interpretation of the rock art site, but to apply conservation measures, okay? This is also very important. Ultimately, the conservation of the site is the most important. So every type of information we can get from these sites, it's going to be very helpful to try to conserve the site, which is the main goal, okay? Thank you.